Judea Black, Shalom L'Chaim, purified drinking water. They got it, it's up there. Got it, that. This next video right here is gonna be about I guess why Europeans enslaved African Americans. You know, it's always the hidden history, the stuff untold, stuff unsaid, stuff that's probably written and just ain't read. Anyway, Judea Black, Shalom L'Chaim, purified drinking water. Let's get into that next video and I cue that music out loud.
As long as I stay comfortable, American privilege keeps burning my vision. As long as I'm comfortable, heritage sickness, American privilege.
Ever wondered why particularly black Africans were enslaved by Europeans? Or why slavery was introduced in a world that had not seen this inhuman form of degradation? Slavery, a grim institution that has taken various forms across history and cultures, played a devastating role in the early Americas. This vast region included the North American colonies, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, and it was a place where the labor of black enslaved Africans and their descendants became the lifeblood of economies. But why Africans? Here, something should be cleared. There was nothing inherently different in the people of Africa and their descendants during the 17th to 19th centuries that made them more vulnerable to enslavement. But as it's a part of history, Europeans considered black Africans less intelligent, beings with power that should be harnessed. First, we must be clear that there's no such thing as benevolent slavery. Any system built on exploiting and coercing labor can never be considered fair. Yet European powers like Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, British, and French were on a quest for conquest and capital, even if they had to introduce slavery. Their explorations of the Americas, spanning from 1492 into the 18th century, weren't driven by the romantic notions of adventure, which we are taught and told in schools. Instead, they were after one thing above all else: wealth. This wealth could be gold, silver, land, farmland, or crops for commerce. The driving force behind their exploration was the desire to bolster European power and enrich royal treasuries. But here's the twist: slavery wasn't their initial source of wealth. Now let's journey to the early 16th century when Spanish colonists in Central and South America seized control of silver and gold mines that had once belonged to the mighty Incan and Aztec empires. They put native groups to work, forcing them to extract these precious resources under deplorable conditions. Their goal: high profits with minimal labor costs, which essentially meant no labor costs because they had no intention of paying anyone. These colonists were ruthless, working native people to the brink of death, even resorting to cutting their hands, arms, and legs if they didn't extract materials quickly enough, or threatening them with death. This brutal exploitation allowed the Spanish to expand their mining efforts and satiate their lust for wealth throughout the 16th century. But despite European hopes of finding abundant gold and silver in other regions like North America or the Caribbean, these areas didn't yield the precious metals they sought. Yet the monarchies and early colonists were undeterred in their pursuit of profit. To achieve this, they turned to crops like sugar, tobacco, rice, and later, cotton, which promised lucrative returns. And to maximize their profits, they increasingly turned to slavery as a means of labor because European laborers demanded payments. So, in this tragic tale, the initial quest for wealth led to the ruthless exploitation of indigenous peoples in Central and South America. It wasn't until later that the plantation economies of the Americas turned to enslave Africans, leading to one of the darkest chapters in human history. For the very first time in history, in 1619, the first black African slaves set foot in Jamestown, Virginia, which would later become part of the United States. But they didn't come here by choice. They were forcibly brought here by the Dutch under British control. You see, even before these Africans arrived in the Americas, others had already been brought to the Caribbean and Latin America. This started way back in the early 16th century, a time when European powers were eager to explore and establish colonies not only in what we know as the US today, but also in South, North, and Central America, along with the Caribbean islands. But here's the twist: the enslavement of black Africans didn't start with the colonization of the Americas. The roots of this practice reach back to the 15th century when the Portuguese, one of those European powers, began enslaving Africans. They did this when they arrived on the African continent for trade. It's crucial to understand that at that time, slavery wasn't limited to black people or those from Africa. It was a broader, more complex system that involved various groups, including Islamic traders, West African communities, and Europeans. And that's when we question, why did European colonists start to exclusively look to black Africans as a source of slave labor? Well, the colonies in the Americas weren't established for the sake of creating fair and equal societies. No, they were all about making money, and the quickest way to do that was by not paying for labor. So the wealthy colonists, who owned vast plantations, saw an opportunity to maximize their profits by relying on enslaved labor. This practice of using enslaved Africans became more widespread throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. By the 19th century, there was a significant enslaved population in the Americas, and slavery had become legally hereditary, meaning that children inherited their enslaved status from their mothers. This was heart-wrenching. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they initially tried to enslave conquered enemies, but that system couldn't sustain itself for several reasons. First, early attempts to enslave Native Americans in the Americas faced difficulties. Native Americans were familiar with the land, making escape or rebellion more likely. The colonists, on the other hand, had little knowledge of these new territories and often fell victim to diseases like malaria, to which they had no immunity. This, along with the widespread genocide of Native American populations and the introduction of new diseases, made large-scale enslavement of Native Americans less feasible. So they turned to Africa as a source of labor, setting the stage for a deeply troubling chapter in history. European colonists began sourcing forced and kidnapped laborers from West Africa for several reasons. First, West Africa was geographically closer to the seaports, making contact and transportation more practical. Second, West African laborers were well versed in the agricultural techniques needed for the mass cultivation of crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton in the Americas. Even though an estimated 9 to 12 million people were forcibly transported from Africa to the Americas as cargo during the transatlantic slave trade, colonists eventually turned to a different method for sustaining slavery: reproduction within the colonies. This allowed slavery to be inherited from mother to child. To justify this never-ending enslavement, a disturbing shift occurred. Scientific racism and racialization evolved as justifications for why only people of African descent could be enslaved. This concept erased the reality that slavery had previously existed across racial lines and was often based on battles and military capture rather than skin color. In other words, black Africans were not enslaved because Europeans knew that they were allegedly less intelligent. Rather, it was due to the ease of enslaving, torturing, and animalizing them. In recent debates about slavery in Britain and the United States, much of the focus understandably revolves around how these systems deeply affected the black communities in the Caribbean and the United States, particularly their descendants. However, it's important to note that the racial beliefs promoted by the European lobbyists in favor of slavery shaped how Europe perceived the entire African continent during the post-slavery era when European powers competed to colonize almost all of Africa. One central figure in propagating racial stereotypes about Africans was Edward Long. Interestingly, Long never set foot on African soil. He came from a family of slave owners in Jamaica, with roots in the Caribbean going back to the mid-17th century. Despite his lack of formal scientific training, his ideas about black Africans in Africa were widely accepted as if they were rigorous and scientific. His famous work, History of Jamaica, written in 1774, was a unique blend of genres, combining elements of a travel guide, discussions on British colonial rule and economics in the Caribbean, and settling political scores. However, it also stands as a classic example of 18th century European pseudo-scientific racism. Edward Long's work was notable for its vehement condemnations of Africans, portraying them as inferior and even questioning their humanity. Despite his clear personal interests as a slave owner, the fact that he spent 12 years in the Caribbean gave his views a certain credibility, helping to explain why his ideas endured. Europeans were reading his book and spreading his ideas, normalizing that black Africans were actually less than humans and should be enslaved. You see, there was a psychological side of this which made Europeans take black African slaves as something natural. But if they were asked to enslave white Europeans and treat them as they did black Africans, they could understand how irrational and inhumane the belief was. Although Edward Long had never set foot on the African continent, he dismissed it as a backward place, branding it as the source of everything that is monstrous in nature. His racism was adaptable. He shifted from defending slavery to justifying colonialism. He played a pivotal role in linking the history of slavery to that of colonialism. The echoes of Edward Long's most venomous ideas influenced subsequent generations of explorers and adventurers who ventured into Africa. Their views of African societies were tainted by the racial theories propagated by Edward and others before they even arrived on the continent. Among the various ideas and theories arising from discussions on slavery, one harmful notion continues to cast a shadow over Africa's image: the belief that tyranny, war, and chaos are inherent to the continent. Long argued that Africa was so barbaric and chaotic that Africans were, in a twisted way, better off as slaves, supposedly saving them from even worse fates in their homelands. Can you see the audacity? In essence, the shift toward racialization erased the diverse history of slavery and framed it as a practice exclusive to people of African descent. Did you know things were so dark and complex behind enslaving black Africans? Isn't it true that they made enslaving black Africans seem much easier than enslaving white Europeans?